Good evening all, welcome back to Mr. Scarer. 10 of the most terrifying real-life horror stories from Alaska will take us to the last frontier tonight. These spine-chilling accounts come directly from the mouths of ice road truckers, bush pilots, oil rig workers, and wilderness professionals who encountered something in America's last untamed wilderness that defied all explanation. Each story has been meticulously verified through multiple sources and corroborating evidence, ranging from the frozen Bering Sea's depths to the inescapable darkness of the Arctic winter. These are not folktales from the campfire or urban legends. Rather, they are actual accounts of people whose lives were forever altered by what they saw in the land of the midnight sun. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that explores the darkest corners of human experience. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the mysteries that lurk just beyond the edge of civilization. Now, let us venture into the brutal beauty of Alaska, where temperatures drop below survivable limits and something far more terrifying than the cold waits in the wilderness. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, but everyone who knows me calls me Tank. I've been driving on Alaska's ice roads for more than 15 years. Let me also tell you something about this job that the majority of people are unaware of. This goes beyond just driving trucks. This is driving for survival. Every mile of these frozen highways is a challenge to nature itself. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, one mechanical breakdown could mean the difference between making it home to your family and becoming another statistic buried under tons of ice and snow. In Phoenix, Arizona, at the age of 28, fresh from a messy divorce, I began this career. Alaska seemed like the ideal location for my escape because I needed to get as far away from my previous life as possible. The ICE road companies were always looking for drivers willing to take the risks that came with hauling vital supplies to remote locations during the harshest months of the year. Although the mortality rate was not mentioned in the recruitment brochures, the pay was excellent. In my first year alone, I witnessed 3 separate collisions that resulted in the deaths of experienced drivers who had been operating these roadways for a greater duration than I ever been alive. The Dalton Highway, also known as the Hall Road, traverses some of North America's harshest terrain for more than 400 meters. Temperatures frequently drop to 40 degrees below zero during the winter. And that's before you take into account the wind chill, which can drop as low as 60 or 70 degrees. The road itself is essentially a gravel-covered sheet of ice that winds through mountain passes and frozen rivers, dropping thousands of feet into rocky gorges where vehicles or bodies are frequently impossible to recover. But here is what keeps me coming back year after year despite the constant danger and isolation. Being out there in that vast wilderness has a purity about it. Only you and your rig are protected from the elements. Only the steady rumble of a diesel engine, the crunch of tires on packed snow, and the endless expanse of white stretching out in every direction. No traffic lights, no city noise, and no modern complications. Until the night that turned everything upside down. At least that was how I felt about it. It was late November of last year, and I was making my 3rd run of the season up to Prudhoe Bay. Heavy snow was predicted by the weather forecast, but nothing I hadn't dealt with dozens of times before. I was transporting a full load of propane tanks for a remote drilling operation near the Arctic Ocean. The risk was worth it because of the valuable cargo, the short deadline, and the substantial reward for on-time delivery. I left Fairbanks just after midnight, planning to take advantage of the lighter traffic during the overnight hours. The first few hours were fairly uneventful. The snow was falling steadily, but not heavily, and the road conditions were about what I expected for late November. The usual mix of weather reports, updates on road conditions, and crude humor that helps pass the time on long drives was being heard on my CB radio from drivers ahead of and behind me. The weather had significantly deteriorated by the time I reached the Yukon River crossing. What had started as light snow had developed into a full-blown whiteout with visibility dropping to less than 20 ft in front of my headlights. The wind was picking up too, creating that disorienting, swirling effect that can make you lose all sense of direction, even when you are following a road you have traveled hundreds of times before. When I first noticed him, I had been driving for about 6 hours. Through the whirling snow, I initially thought my eyes were tricking me, but as I got closer, I couldn't have been more wrong. In the typical hitchhiker position, a lone individual was standing at the roadside with his arm outstretched and thumb pointed upward. On the ice roads, picking up hitchhikers is not something that is done. There are too many dangers. The problem of liability is too complicated. And frankly, anyone crazy enough to be out walking in these conditions probably was not someone you wanted in your cab. But this particular circumstance bothered me in some way. The figure was not appropriately dressed for the weather. He was wearing what looked like a light jacket, no hat, no gloves that I could see. He ought to have died from exposure within minutes at these temperatures. Yet there he stood, apparently unaffected by the brutal cold that was making even my heated cab feel inadequate. Against my better judgment, I started slowing down. Maybe it was the ingrained human instinct to help someone in distress. Or maybe it was just curiosity about how anyone could survive out there so underdressed. I stopped my truck about 10 feet past where he was standing for whatever reason and waited to see what would happen. The man approached the passenger side of the cab with measured, unhurried steps. I could see that his movements were odd, almost mechanical, and lacked the urgency of someone who had been standing in sub-zero temperatures, even through the blowing snow. He knocked twice on the door when he got there, a soft sound that somehow stood out against the howling wind. In order to speak with him, I rolled down the window just enough. "Where do you intend to go?" In order to be heard over the storm, I had to shout and raise my voice. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he was listening to something I could not hear. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and calm, with no trace of the chattering teeth or labored breathing you would expect from someone suffering from cold exposure. North was all he said. That ought to have been my first real sign that something was wrong with this. No one responds in such a hazy manner when they are in a situation where their life is in danger. On the other hand, the storm was getting worse by the minute, and the more time I spent sitting there with the window open, the less heat I was getting out of the taxi. I made a choice that would have long-lasting negative effects on my life. He was told by me to get in. He appeared too graceful for someone who should have been half frozen as he eased into the passenger seat. As soon as he settled in, and I got my first good look at him in the cab lights, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't quite pinpoint, and that I couldn't quite explain. His eyes were a washed-out blue with no real depth or warmth, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. However, I was troubled by more than just his physical appearance. The air in the cab felt heavy and oppressive due to his presence, similar to the atmosphere prior to a severe thunderstorm. As we got back on the road, I tried to talk to him by asking him the usual questions about where he came from, how long he had been waiting, and how he was doing. When I tried to make small talk with him, he didn't say a word. Instead, he just sat there and stared blankly and straight ahead through the windshield. The only time he moved was when he turned his head and studied me in a way that made my skin crawl with those pale eyes. As time passed and we moved deeper into the wilderness, the storm only got worse. Earlier in the evening, the CB radio, which had been intermittently communicating, had gone completely silent. Even the static appeared muted, and it appeared as though the storm was somehow interfering with radio transmissions in a way I had never seen before. The cab's atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense as my strange passenger sat next to me in complete silence. The feeling of being alone got worse. Things started to get really strange around the mark of the Arctic Circle. The man, who had not spoken a word since he'd gotten into the truck, suddenly turned to me and said, "You are not safe here." When I heard his voice after hours of silence, I actually jumped out of my seat. However, his sudden speech wasn't the only thing that shocked me. His voice sounded hollow, like an echo from a far distance. In addition, the words themselves caused me to feel a chill that was unrelated to the cold outside. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing dread in my chest. He raised a pale hand and pointed toward the passenger side window rather than responding to my inquiry. He simply stated, "Look." With my heart pounding against my ribcage, I gave a quick glance around and slammed on the brakes right away. Parallel to the road, dark figures that shouldn't have been there were moving through the trees. Their deliberate movement suggested intelligence rather than animal instinct, and they were too big to be wolves or bears. One of the figures came out of the trees and ran across the road in front of my headlights while I was watching. I only caught a glimpse of something that looked almost human, but was wrong in ways my brain couldn't quite process, because it moved so quickly. What on earth did that mean? I was insistent. But he was gone when I turned to look at my passenger. He gave the impression that he had never even been in the passenger seat. There was not even a trace of body heat or an impression in the seat cushion to suggest that anyone had been seated there. I was alone in the cab, alone on the road, alone in the storm, with whatever those things were moving through the darkness around me. I didn't stop to look into it. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and got out of there, as fast as the road conditions would allow, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely keep the steering wheel steady. I drove for the next 2 hours in a controlled panic, jumping at every shadow at the edge of my headlight beams and constantly checking my mirrors for signs of a pursuit. I sat in my cab for a long time, trying to process what had happened. When I finally reached the safety of the Dead Horse truck stop, I told myself that it had to be hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and the stress of driving in severe weather conditions. But I knew for sure that what I had gone through was real. Over the following few months, I ran into the pale-eyed hitchhiker 3 more times, each time in similar circumstances of bad weather and poor visibility. Each time he would show up at the side of the road, climb into my cab without giving me a reason, sit silently for hours, and then vanish without a trace, just as something inexplicable would happen. Other drivers whose stories I talked to described the same figure, pale eyes, and eerie presence. Because this job is all I know, and Alaska is now my home, I continue to drive the ice roads. However, regardless of how hopeless their situation may appear, I no longer pick up hitchhikers. Some roads are more than just routes to other locations. There are roads that take you to areas that shouldn't be open. Additionally, some passengers do not require physical location-based transportation. Do not stop if, while driving the Dalton Highway in the winter, you come upon a pale-eyed man standing at the roadside. Keep driving and do not look back. Trust me on this. Some help is not worth giving, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. And Captain Jake Morrison is my name, and I come from a long line of fishermen who have survived by fishing Alaska's harsh waters. My grandfather, Samuel Morrison, started this family tradition back in 1952 when he purchased his first boat with money saved from working in the canneries. Robert Morrison, expanded the business and instilled in me a deep love of the ocean and the knowledge that the sea gives and takes according to its own enigmatic rules. I'm what you'd call a third-generation commercial fisherman, and I've been captaining fishing boats for over 22 years in the dangerous Bering Sea waters. A commercial fisherman's life in Alaska is nothing short of brutal. It demands everything from you, your body, your mind, and sometimes your soul. We face bone-chilling cold that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, monstrous seas that can swallow entire vessels without a trace, and relentless storms that turn the ocean into a churning battlefield between man and nature. The profession's mortality rate is alarming. Good men vanish under the waves each season, leaving behind families who never get a proper closure. But despite all the dangers and hardships, there is nothing quite like the thrill of a successful catch and the deep, almost spiritual connection to the vast ocean that has sustained my family for 3 generations. It's not just a job or a career to fish in these waters. It becomes a way of life that stays with you for the rest of your life. I've been on frozen decks where every step could result in a fatal slip into water that causes hypothermia. I have fought against massive waves that looked like liquid mountains rising above our ship and threatened to crush us. I have endured the near-constant threat of frostbite, equipment failures in life, threatening situations, and the psychological toll of months at sea, in some of the most isolated waters on Earth. But nothing in my 2 decades of experience on these dangerous seas could have prepared me for what happened during one particular storm season trip that took place last October. The expedition got off to a typical fishing haul start. My crew of 10 seasoned fishermen set sail from Dutch Harbor on what appeared to be a clear autumn morning, our vessel loaded with equipment and supplies for what we anticipated would be a profitable 3-week expedition. Our goal was to catch the most pollock and king crab of the season from the Bering Sea's productive fishing grounds. The ocean surface sparkled beautifully against the low, hanging Arctic sun, and the familiar scent of salt water and marine life wafted through the crisp and revitalizing air. But as we pushed further away from the relative safety of the harbor and into the open ocean, the weather conditions began to take a dramatic and ominous turn for the worse. Pete Rodriguez, my first mate, a seasoned fisherman with 15 years of experience, made his usual jokes about enjoying the calm before the inevitable storm as we maneuvered through increasingly turbulent open water. Pete is the kind of person who keeps his sense of humor, even when there is imminent danger. But even he could not hide the growing tension that all of us were beginning to feel. The atmospheric pressure was dropping rapidly, and the air itself seemed to be growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing hour. Our breath became visible in dense clouds, even inside the heated cabin that evening as the sky began to prematurely darken and thick fog began to roll in from the western horizon. By the time we reached our designated fishing area, approximately 60 mi from the nearest land, the thick fog had completely smothered the horizon in an impenetrable wall of ghostly gray mist. The wind howled through our vessel's rigging like a chorus of tormented spirits, and our aging but reliable fishing boat groaned and creaked under the relentless assault of increasingly violent waves. My experienced crew hauled in nets and processed our catch amid the constant symphony of mechanical groans and the threatening crash of waves against our hull. Working with the practiced precision that comes from years of facing such challenges together, we pulled up something that made even the toughest and most experienced men on board stop their work and stare in silence during one particularly exhausting and challenging net haul as we fought against the churning sea and our own physical exhaustion. Our fishing nets were entangled, twisted between the typical catch of fish and crab, with the carcass of a creature that none of us had ever seen before in our combined years of commercial fishing. The animal's body was covered in what appeared to be overlapping scales that shimmered with an oily iridescent quality. Similar to wet stone reflecting moonlight, it measured at least 10 feet from head to tail. Its powerful limbs ended in gnarled claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. Additionally, the jaws of its elongated skull were lined with rows of razor, sharp teeth that appeared to be designed for crushing rather than simply biting. Most alarming of all were its eyes, which, despite being clouded with death, somehow maintained an unsettling appearance of ominous intelligence, as if this creature had cognitive abilities that were far beyond those of any known marine animal. This was the most disturbing aspect of the creature. As we all gathered around this impossible discovery, the entire deck fell into a strange silence. Each man was attempting to comprehend what he was seeing. Had our nets somehow dredged up some prehistoric sea beast that had been preserved in the icy depths for millions of years? Is it possible that shifting ocean currents or the gradual thinning of underwater ice formations brought this species from the depths of the deep sea, which was previously unknown to scientists? Our normally unflappable crew felt genuine unease ripples as a result of the wild speculation and nervous theorizing that followed. But the nightmare was just getting started. We discovered that the creature's remains were intertwined with objects that defied all logic as we continued to untangle our nets and examine our bizarre catch more closely. Although their design and construction suggested an origin far older than any known human civilization, these were clearly artificial artifacts created with evident intelligence and purpose. The objects appeared vaguely humanoid in their basic shape and proportions, as if they had been created to represent some form of bipedal beings. But their surfaces were encrusted with layers of barnacles, coral growth, and marine deposits that suggested they had been resting on the ocean floor for countless centuries. Strange inscriptions carved or etched into these artifacts were the most alarming. Motifs and symbols that, when illuminated by our powerful deck lights, had the appearance of a faint, otherworldly luminescence. None of us had ever seen any written language or decorative motifs like the symbols. Yet something about their arrangement and repetition suggested they conveyed specific meaning or purpose to those who understood their significance. Our ship was enveloped in a deep sense of unease that was heavier and more oppressive than any storm cloud we had ever seen. It was like a suffocating blanket. With each passing day, our regular radio communications with other fishing vessels in the area began to receive alarming and increasingly alarming reports. Captains described inexplicable equipment malfunctions that occurred without warning, the complete disappearance of entire crews from vessels that were later found floating empty and abandoned, and increasingly bizarre sightings of unexplained lights and shadowy figures moving through the fog-covered waters. The close-knit community of Bering Sea fishermen heard about these strange happenings at an alarming rate. The hushed whispers of cursed waters and ancient sea spirits who had somehow been awakened and enraged by human intrusion into their domain replaced conversations that had once focused on weather conditions, fish populations, and market prices. Our own vessel was far from immune to these supernatural afflictions that seemed to be spreading like a plague throughout the fishing fleet. We could clearly hear a chorus of whispering voices that appeared to emanate from the very fog that surrounded us, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. This occurred on our 5th night at sea, during a particularly violent storm that battered us with waves that were nearly 40 feet in height. A sudden wall of seawater crashed over our deck with tremendous force, carrying something that chilled us far more than the freezing temperature of the water itself. Many of the men swore they could distinguish individual voices within this supernatural chorus, chanting in rhythmic patterns that were both hypnotic and deeply terrifying. Several crew members claimed to have seen patterns of pulsating lights below the surface of the water that seemed to match the ethereal chanting. We discovered absolutely nothing that could account for what we had all witnessed. When I ordered immediate and thorough searches of both the deck and the areas below deck in the hope of discovering some rational explanation for these phenomena, then Like a creeping infection, signs of psychological breakdown began to manifest among my crew members. At first, the symptoms weren't too obvious. Persistent lack of sleep, vivid nightmares, escalating irritability and hostility, and reports of seeing shadowy figures move outside the portholes in the dead of night are all associated with this condition. But as the days progressed, these disturbing behaviors escalated to truly alarming levels that threatened the safety and functionality of our entire operation. Crew members who had been trustworthy and disciplined before started openly defying orders and getting into violent physical fights in the cramped quarters. And worst of all, some would simply vanish from the vessel for hours at a time without explanation. When these men who had gone missing returned, they were completely different, far away, possessed, and speaking in the same unidentified languages that we had heard in that supernatural chorus. Their bodily movements became jerky and unnatural, as if they were being controlled by some external force, and they would constantly mutter to unseen presences, responding to voices that only they could hear. An unseen, evil presence appeared to tighten its grip on our vessel. Despite my desperate efforts to maintain order and keep my crew focused on our work and survival, our navigation equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied mechanical explanation with each passing day. With compasses spinning wildly and GPS systems providing readings that placed us in impossible locations, our engines would suddenly howl with mechanical fury before falling completely silent without warning, leaving us drifting helplessly on the increasingly hostile sea. The absolute breaking point came during a night when a tempest of unprecedented fury lashed our vessel with lightning that seemed to claw across the black heavens and mountainous waves that threatened to tear our boat apart piece by piece. A massive crash rang out from the lower decks below as I stood on the bridge, desperately attempting to maintain control and coordinate our efforts to survive. I ran down to investigate the cause of this new crisis, abandoning my post only to discover that our main net storage room had been transformed into a nightmare. The room's walls were completely covered in a thick, oily substance that looked like it had a life of its own. It twisted and pulsated with a sinister rhythm that was unlike anything I had ever seen in nature. The substance appeared to be spreading across every surface, consuming everything it touched and leaving behind an otherworldly darkness that hurt to look at directly. Before I could react or retreat, the heavy metal door slammed shut behind me with tremendous force, trapping me inside this nightmarish chamber. The room was plunged into an absolute darkness that was only broken by eerie patches of sickly green luminescence emanating from the spreading black substance. The overhead lighting began to violently flicker before completely going out. From somewhere within the suffocating gloom, I heard a deep guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the ship. As my eyes adjusted to the hellish environment, I watched in absolute terror as the shadows began to coalesce and solidify into horrifying shapes. Twisted half-human monstrosities covered in scales and marine growth, with elongated limbs ending in razor-sharp claws and eyes that burned with primeval fury and hunger. As paralyzing fear threatened to completely consume me, my heart pounded against my ribs. I threw myself against the locked door, using all of my strength and determination, and I was able, out of sheer desperation, to force it open just enough to get through and get back to the chaos of the bridge above. There were emergency alarms going off all over the ship, and the ship was rocking so hard that it was almost impossible to stand on one foot. Against the backdrop of churning waves and howling wind, which appeared determined to drag us all down to join whatever ancient horrors we had awakened from the depths, the final struggle for our survival took place. As the black substance spread like a living plague, devouring everything in its path and turning our ship into a floating nightmare, flames erupted throughout the crew quarters. As the men I had worked with for years collapsed in supernatural agony, I watched helplessly as they were swallowed up by the growing darkness. When dawn finally broke, after what felt like an eternity of horror, our battered vessel was somehow still afloat, though scarred beyond recognition. The few survivors who remained gathered on the blood-stained deck, their faces pale with shock and their voices reduced to trembling whispers. The sea around us had returned to an unnatural stillness, and the fog had lifted to reveal nothing but endless gray horizons stretching in all directions with no signs of rescue or familiar landmarks. We continued to drift for an additional 3 days before a passing cargo ship heard our distress call and brought us back to Dutch Harbor. By that time, we were men who had fallen apart. Our minds had been torn apart by forces that were beyond our comprehension. Our bodies had been shattered by supernatural terror, and our souls had been burdened with the knowledge of the horrors that lurked beneath the waves. Since that voyage, I have shared the complete truth of what happened with only a handful of people I trust absolutely. Although equipment failures and severe weather were mentioned in the Coast Guard's official report, the true cause of our crew losses was not mentioned. Nevertheless, I am completely aware of the chilling truth. Something ancient, ferocious, and vengeful dwells beneath the Bering Sea's frozen surface. In the vast depths, patiently waiting for the unwary to venture too far from the shore. I continue to make my living from the sea, as fishing is in my blood and the only life I have ever known. But I steer well clear of those cursed fishing grounds, and I have shared warnings with every fisherman who will listen. The ocean guards its darkest secrets jealously, and some catches are far better left unfished, rotting in the depths where they belong. My name is Dr. Thompson. Rebecca, I am a wildlife biologist with a focus on the ecology of large mammals. For the past 10 years, I have devoted my life to studying the majestic animals that live in Alaska's vast wilderness. With a dissertation on the relationships between predators and prey in Arctic ecosystems, I received my doctorate from the University of Montana. Additionally, I spend most of my time at work in Denali National Park, which not only has breathtaking beauty but also deep, ancient secrets. I pride myself on using science, logic, and rigorous observation to unravel the mysteries of animal behavior in what many would call the last true frontier. However, there are times when even the most rigorous scientific methods are unable to explain what is observed deep in the wilderness. Approximately 40 meters from the established ranger stations, and well beyond the tourist trails that the majority of visitors never go past, our research team had planned a lengthy field trip deep into Denali. The primary objective was to investigate a particular caribou population's seasonal migration patterns, which appeared to be affected by recent shifts in vegetation patterns and climate conditions. We had spent months getting the right permits, getting the best gear for the cold, and putting together equipment like GPS tracking collars and motion-activated remote cameras with enough food and scientific tools to last us for 3 weeks in complete isolation. There were 4 individuals chosen with care for the expedition team. Sarah Lopez, a promising graduate student from Alaska Pacific University who was eager to contribute meaningful field work to her thesis research, and James O'Connor, our seasoned park guide, whose knowledge of the remote backcountry areas was absolutely essential for navigating the challenging terrain safely, were also present. I was the doctor in charge of the project. Marcus Hale, a fellow biologist who specializes in the behavior patterns of large carnivores, was also present. We were pleasantly surprised by the first few days of our expedition. Crystal clear skies stretched endlessly above us. The landscape around us was gloriously alive with the calls of migrating birds and the constant rustle of small mammals moving through the dense underbrush. Temperatures remained relatively mild for the season. We had developed a strict daily routine of surveying predetermined transects, collecting soil and vegetation samples, and strategically positioning our monitoring equipment along known animal corridors. We were all energized by the thrill of being completely surrounded by unspoiled, raw nature. We marveled at the incredible resilience of life flourishing in such harsh environmental conditions and felt genuinely fortunate to witness some of the last truly great wilderness remaining on Earth. However, despite its reassuring and methodical nature, routine frequently breaks down without warning. The entire atmosphere of the wilderness began to change in ways that defied scientific explanation on the fourth day of our expedition, as we set out to place additional remote monitoring devices near a river crossing that was frequently used by moose and caribou herds. A persistent low fog began to roll in from the southern valleys as the air became unnaturally heavy and oppressive, almost thick enough to feel against our skin. We felt an ominous silence pressing against our eardrums as the forest, which had been alive with the constant chatter of wildlife and bird calls, quieted down. Even the usual sound of wind moving through the towering spruce and birch trees became muted and distant. In addition to the unsettling sensation that the woods themselves were holding their collective breath, I noticed an inexplicable buildup of tension in my chest. Our progress slowed considerably as the fog thickened and reduced our visibility to just a few feet in any direction. James, our experienced guide, suddenly signaled for us to halt as he carefully scanned the dim clearing that lay ahead of us. As he darted between the gloomy trees, his normally calm demeanor was replaced by visible tension. His jaw clenched tightly and his eyes narrowed. "I do not like this situation," he whispered, his voice low and filled with unmistakable concern. "Out here, we are not the only ones." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I felt uneasy as I looked around at the forest that was covered in fog that surrounded us. Then we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo through the ground beneath our boots and came from somewhere deep within the mist-covered woods. Unlike any predator vocalization I had ever encountered in my years of field research, this sound vibrated through the ground itself, carrying with it something primal and filled with raw ancient hatred. The rising tide of fear threatened to overwhelm our rational thinking, and our educated scientific minds fought valiantly against it. Marcus took the rifle from me right away, a clear sign that neither of us felt safe in this situation. We instinctively formed a tight defensive circle and began looking in every direction through the dense forest. Our senses were at their sharpest and most alert. Then, emerging slowly from the thick mist like something from a nightmare, we saw a form that defied all biological classification. Through the swirling fog, it was hard to make out specifics, but the creature moved with an unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. It was clear that this was not a typical animal of any known species. The thing appeared twisted and vaguely humanoid in shape, covered entirely in matted, filthy fur with limbs that bent at angles that violated every principle of mammalian anatomy. Most alarming of all were its eyes, which locked directly onto our small group with an intelligence that was unmistakably evil and glowed with an unnatural luminescence. Over the next hour, the hostile presence surrounding our position became increasingly aggressive and threatening. In the distance, we could hear huge branches snapping, and the harsh echoes of otherworldly howls suggested that we were dealing with more than one creature. We cautiously retreated in the direction of a rocky outcropping that overlooked the raging river below, following James' urgent direction. Here, the elevated terrain offered some tactical advantage, and we quickly established a campfire to help hold back the encroaching darkness that seemed to be pressing in from all sides. However, the long night that lay ahead was anything but peaceful. Every flicker of our campfire cast monstrous shadows that appeared to move independently of their sources, preventing us from falling asleep as violent chills gripped her entire body. Sarah clenched her research notebook against her chest and mumbled fragmented prayers under her breath. James worked tirelessly around our small perimeter, constantly scanning the impenetrable darkness beyond our firelight for any signs of movement. While Marcus kept a steady, vigilant watch throughout the night, his rifle was always focused on the pitch black forest. The gloomy evidence of the night's supernatural visitation surfaced at dawn. The metal casings of several of our expensive remote cameras were twisted beyond recognition and were completely buried in the underbrush. The electronic parts of several previously tagged caribou's GPS tracking collars were scattered across the forest floor after being torn to shreds. Most troubling of all, there were no signs of blood or animal remains in the area. Just the destroyed equipment left behind, like calling cards from an invisible predator. The message was unmistakably clear. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just after the wildlife in the area. They were also specifically after our research team, for reasons we couldn't even begin to fathom. Our scientific determination to collect meaningful data drove us deeper into clearly forbidden territory, despite the obvious and growing danger. The following day, we moved in the direction of a series of cave entrances that James had previously marked on our topographical maps. He said that these places were steeped in indigenous legends and carried whispered warnings from the native communities in the area about disturbing ancient resting places. Upon entering the largest of these caves, the air immediately turned fetid and stale, carrying the unmistakable stench of death and decay. Numerous ancient bones, some clearly belonging to humans and others to a variety of animal species, all in varying stages of decomposition and age, littered the rocky floor. The cavern appeared to be surrounded by a chokehold of evil and prehistoric evil over every square inch. We began to hear a whisper from the stone walls all around us that was almost unnoticeable. The sound shook me to my very core. It is evident that scientific observation and data collection were not intended for this location. It was the entry point to something that existed far beyond natural law. Sarah screamed in absolute terror without warning. The horrifying sequence of events that followed unfolded with terrifying swiftness. She had simply vanished, as if she had never existed. When we turned to hear her voice, in a fit of frantic desperation, we searched the forest for hours calling her name, until our voices became raw. There was absolutely no trace of her anywhere. There are no tracks in the soft soil. A path is not indicated by broken foliage. There was no torn clothing that got caught on branches. There was absolutely no indication that she had ever been with us. Nothing more than a constant silence that seemed to scream louder than the forest had ever screamed. Our increasing terror was not subdued by the following night. I felt unseen eyes, constantly watching our every movement from the darkness, as if my enhanced senses had betrayed me. Ghostly figures appeared to dance between the trees at the very edge of our vision. When I tried to focus on them directly, James reluctantly began sharing local indigenous folklore tales about Wendigos, fabled spirits who were cursed with being born from extreme starvation and cannibalistic madness and destined to stalk the deep forests in an endless hunger and supernatural wrath. I had always dismissed such tales as primitive mythology as a scientist. However, the mounting evidence of something beyond natural explanation was systematically undermining every rational theory I could come up with. The event that ended our scientific expedition was then shattered. During his morning routine check of his equipment, Marcus vanished. His final radio transmission, which consisted solely of fragmented static punctuated by a single terrified whisper, is one that I will never forget. It recognizes us. It is on its way. Left completely alone in that cursed wilderness, I hastily gathered whatever supplies I could carry and attempted to retrace our original route back to civilization. However, I found that the familiar routes had mysteriously changed overnight. The previous day, trails that were marked and simple to follow were suddenly overgrown or appeared to have disappeared entirely. I realized with growing horror that we were no longer operating within a realm governed by natural laws, but had become trapped within the boundaries of an ancient curse that defied all rational explanation. I had to deal with constant encounters, with threats I couldn't see that followed me just out of sight, even though I eventually got out of that nightmare. I had become nothing more than a ghost of the self-assured scientist who had entered the wilderness weeks earlier when I finally stumbled into the safety of the ranger station. I was spiritually haunted, physically and emotionally exhausted, and forever marked by being exposed to secrets that the vast wilderness had kept hidden for centuries. Since returning to civilization, I have devoted the remainder of my career to searching for answers that bridge the gap between rigorous scientific inquiry and respect for the ancient mysteries that stubbornly refuse to be tamed by modern understanding. The human mind cannot bear the weight of some truths. There are parts of Alaska that are supposed to be uninhabited at all times, as a constant reminder of the supernatural powers that lurk in the darkest corners of the last wild places on our planet. I still hear the echoes of those ancient evil creatures in my dreams every night. Today, I tell my story as a warning to future researchers and a scientific record. Be careful if you decide to venture into Alaska's vast wilderness. Always remember that there are always unseen eyes watching from the darkness, and show proper respect to the old legends that have been passed down through the generations. Even though most people in my village call me Joe, my name is Joseph Tikovic. I am a member of the Inupiaq people, and I have lived my entire life in the remote village of Kaktok, located on the northern coast of Alaska near the Arctic Circle. I've been subsistence hunting for more than 40 years, a practice that has supported my family and community for many generations. My grandfather taught me the ancient skills of tracking, hunting, and reading the signs that nature provides to those who know how to observe and listen. These are not merely survival techniques. We are connected to our ancestors and the land that has always provided for our people through these sacred responsibilities. In the Arctic, subsistence hunting necessitates knowledge that cannot be acquired through casual observation or reading books. You need to know about caribou migration patterns, seal and whale behavioral cycles, and the seasonal movements of every animal in this harsh but generous landscape. More importantly, you must respect the spiritual aspects of hunting that govern the relationship between humans and the animal spirits that allow themselves to be taken for the survival of our families. My grandfather, Natikovic, was one of the most respected elders in our community, a man whose wisdom encompassed the traditional tales, spiritual practices, and cultural knowledge that define our people's identity in addition to his hunting skills. From the time I was old enough to walk on the tundra, he taught me not only the practical aspects of hunting, but also the ancient protocols that ensure harmony between humans and the spirits that inhabit every living creature. Among the most important lessons my grandfather shared with me were the warnings about certain animals that should never be hunted under any circumstances. These were not ordinary creatures, he explained, but beings that possessed intelligence and supernatural abilities far beyond those of natural animals. In our traditional language, he referred to them as the mimickers, or those who wear false faces. These beings, according to our earliest tales, could be any animal, but they still possessed human intelligence and a deep hatred for those who hunted without respect or spiritual preparation. The traditional warnings gave very clear instructions on how to spot these dangerous creatures. They would display behavior patterns that seemed almost human in their calculation and cunning. They would observe hunters from afar, picking up on their routines and preferences. Most dangerous of all, they could perfectly imitate the calls and sounds of genuine animals, using these deceptions to lure hunters into isolated areas where they would become the prey rather than the predator. My grandfather emphasized repeatedly that these warnings were not mere folklore or primitive superstitions, but practical survival knowledge passed down through generations of hunters who had encountered these entities and lived to share their experiences with their descendants. He explained to me that the modern world's rejection of such traditional wisdom had resulted in perilous situations in which hunters educated in Western school but ignorant of their ancient wisdom, or returned from their vanished, or returned from hunting expeditions fundamentally encounters was as as a result of encounters with forces they did not comprehend. He said this had caused the situation. For most of my adult life, I followed my grandfather's teachings faithfully, maintaining the proper spiritual protocols, respecting the traditional hunting seasons and restrictions, and avoiding the specific areas and situations that our ancestral knowledge identified as dangerous. I hunted with great success, honoring the cultural practices that define our relationship with the land and its inhabitants, while also providing meat for my family and contributing to the community's food security. However, 3 years ago, modern pressures began to challenge my adherence to traditional restrictions in ways that ultimately resulted in a confrontation with the very entities about which my grandfather had warned me as a child. Many of the traditional migration patterns that our community relied on for subsistence, hunting had been disrupted by climate change. Caribou herds were arriving later, and in smaller numbers than historical patterns had predicted. Sea ice formation changes were affecting seal populations, making traditional hunting methods less reliable. At the same time, increasing costs for fuel, ammunition, and equipment meant that successful hunting expeditions were becoming more critical for my family's economic survival. During a particularly difficult winter, when our community's meat supplies were running dangerously low, I made the decision to venture into hunting areas that my grandfather had specifically warned me to avoid. These were remote valleys about 50 miles inland from our village. During the coldest months, when the ground was frozen solid enough to support vehicular travel, you could only get to them by snowmobile. According to traditional knowledge, these valleys were home to entities that our ancestors had learned to avoid through generations of bitter experience. The stories described creatures that appeared to be ordinary caribou or wolves, but possessed supernatural intelligence and the ability to coordinate complex hunting strategies against human prey. Most disturbing of all, these entities could perfectly mimic human voices, using the calls of lost hunters to lure rescuers into traps where they too would disappear without a trace. Despite my lifelong respect for ancestral wisdom, the pressing needs of my family and community convinced me that modern hunting equipment and techniques would provide adequate protection against whatever dangers might exist in these forbidden areas. I argued that traditional warnings might have been based on encounters with natural predators that would not pose much of a threat to a hunter equipped with modern communication tools and high-powered rifles. On a clear February morning, I took a snowmobile and set out for the forbidden valleys with enough supplies for a week's worth of travel. The journey to the hunting area required 6 hours of travel across increasingly remote and desolate terrain. A sudden shift in the atmosphere and the behavior of the wildlife as I got closer to the valleys my grandfather had warned me about should have prompted me to immediately turn around. The typical sounds of wildlife in the Arctic, the calls of ravens, the distant howling of wolves, the rustling movements of small mammals became completely absent as I entered the valley system. I could hear my own heartbeat and breathing with unusual clarity because the silence was so profound. It appeared as though the sound from my snowmobile engine was muffled and far away, as if it were being absorbed by an invisible force that covered the entire area. The complete absence of any animal footprints or signs was even more alarming. In normal hunting areas, even during the harshest winter conditions, you can always find evidence of wildlife activity. scat deposits, tracks in the snow, feeding areas where animals have dug through the snow to reach vegetation, and tracks in the snow, however. There were no indications that any living things had ever resided in, or even passed through these valleys. I began to notice that I was being observed and followed by entities on my second day in the forbidden territory. These entities kept their distance, but made it clear that they were conducting their surveillance in a coordinated and intelligent manner. I was able to see what appeared to be caribou, positioned on the ridges and hilltops, surrounding my camping area through my binoculars. However, their behavior was completely unlike that of an animal that could be found in nature. These animals never grazed or moved in the erratic patterns of caribou herds, and they remained motionless for hours at a time. They seemed to be positioned strategically to maintain visual contact with my location from multiple directions simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, when I moved to a different location within the valley, the watching animals would relocate in coordinated fashion to maintain their surveillance network around my new position. On the third night, the entities tried to talk to each other, directly using voices that were exactly like those of humans. The sound of my own name, being called from somewhere outside my tent, jolted me awake around midnight. With her distinctive accent and speech patterns, the voice was identical to my wife's. She claimed to be injured and lost beyond my campsite and was calling for assistance. Every instinct developed through 40 years of traditional hunting experience. I was informed that this was precisely the kind of deception about which my grandfather had warned me. However, hearing my wife's distressed voice had a profound emotional impact. Only the specific warnings about voice mimicry that I had been taught as a child prevented me from falling into what was clearly a trap when I came very close to leaving the safety of my shelter to investigate. The voice kept calling for help throughout the night, sometimes using my wife's voice, sometimes imitating the voices of my children, and sometimes the voices of other community members who would never have been near my location. It was designed to take advantage of my natural protective instincts. The psychological pressure of ignoring these pleas for help was intense, and I began to understand how hunters who were unfamiliar with traditional warnings could easily be lured away from safety by entities that understood exactly which emotional triggers would be most effective. On my fourth day in the valley, I decided that the situation was too dangerous to continue and began making plans to return to my village. This was the final confrontation. I was surrounded by a group of creatures as I loaded my gear onto the snowmobile. They had approached my campsite in a coordinated, stealthy way that only wild animals could have done. Everything I thought I knew about the biology and normal behavior of wildlife was wrong about what I saw. These entities appeared to be wolves, but they moved with upright posture and coordinated their actions with obvious intelligence and planning. Their eyes held unmistakable awareness and malice, and when they began to speak using perfectly replicated human voices, I understood that I was facing exactly the type of supernatural predators my ancestors had learned to fear and respect. The entities didn't attack right away. Rather, they tried to negotiate, promising to let me leave safely if I promised to bring more hunters to their territory in the future. They demonstrated knowledge of our spiritual beliefs and cultural practices that could only have been acquired through decades or centuries of observation by speaking fluently in Inupiat. I managed to escape only by invoking traditional spiritual protections that my grandfather had taught me, but that I had never expected to need in actual practice. I was able to reach my snowmobile and begin the journey back to safety thanks to the old words and ceremonies that retained their power and established barriers that the entities were unable to cross. I've talked about this experience with other hunters and elders since I got back to my village, stressing how important ancestral warnings are still today. Our people's traditional knowledge is survival information that is just as important today as it was centuries ago. It has been passed down through generations, regardless of the pressures brought on by shifting economic and environmental conditions. Some boundaries should never be crossed, and some ancient wisdom should never be ignored. The land holds secrets that date back to before people lived here. Those who hunt to survive rather than conquer prefer to keep some of these secrets a secret. My name is Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos, and I have served as a rescue swimmer with the United States Coast Guard for the past 12 years. In Southeast Alaska, where I am stationed, Air Station Sitka, our primary duty is to carry out search and rescue operations in some of the most challenging maritime conditions in North America. Even experienced sailors can be overwhelmed within minutes of encountering equipment failure or navigation errors in the waters surrounding the Alexander Archipelago due to the erratic weather, hidden reefs, and currents that are renowned for their ability to overwhelm them. My training as a rescue swimmer required 18 months of intensive physical conditioning, advanced swimming techniques, emergency medical response, and helicopter operations procedures. Prior to completing basic certification, approximately 70% of candidates are eliminated through the selection process, and ongoing training requirements ensure that only the most capable and dedicated individuals remain active rescue swimmers. I take pride in my perfect mission, completion record, and my reputation for maintaining operational effectiveness under the most extreme conditions imaginable. I have been a part of over 200 successful rescues over the course of my career. These rescues have ranged from simple mechanical assistance calls to more complicated multi-casualty incidents involving vessels in severe distress. I have rescued people from sinking fishing boats, given injured mariners in remote areas medical attention, and coordinated helicopter evacuations in weather that pushed both personnel and equipment to their limits. The unique obstacles in Southeast Alaska necessitate constant vigilance and adaptability on the part of rescue workers. The region's intricate geography includes thousands of islands, slender channels, and concealed passages where ships can vanish without warning from radar contact. Abandoned facilities from the historical fishing and cannery industries create navigational hazards that are not always accurately marked on current charts. Most significantly, the area's weather patterns can shift from calm conditions to life-threatening storms within hours, stranding mariners who were previously in no apparent danger. The incident that fundamentally altered my understanding of what is possible within the scope of Coast Guard operations began with what appeared to be a routine distress call received at our operations center on October 15th of last year. Our communications personnel intercepted a Mayday transmission from the Pacific Dawn, a commercial fishing vessel, reporting engine failure and taking on water 20 nautical miles southwest of Baranof Island around 400 hours ago. The vessel's identification, crew complement, and precise location coordinates were provided in the initial distress call, which adhered to standard maritime emergency procedures. The caller's voice conveyed stress appropriate to their reported situation, without implying panic or immediate life-threatening circumstances, and the transmission quality was clear. This appeared to be a straightforward mechanical assistance case that could be resolved through standard rescue procedures. Based on the information provided, I was assigned as primary rescue swimmer for the operation, working with helicopter crew, consisting of Pilot Lieutenant Commander James Hartley, Co-Pilot Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, and Flight Mechanic Petty Officer Second S. David Kim. Our aircraft was a Sikorsky MH-60 Jock with advanced navigation systems, medical equipment, and rescue hoisting capabilities. It was designed for long-range search and rescue operations. Weather conditions at departure were favorable with clear visibility and moderate winds that posed no significant operational challenges. We maintained radio contact with the Pacific Dawn and received regular updates on their condition and circumstances during the 35-minute flight to the reported distress coordinates. Upon reaching the coordinates provided in the initial Mayday call, we immediately located the reported vessel and began standard rescue assessment procedures. The Pacific Dawn appeared to be a 60-foot-long commercial fishing vessel, which is typical for vessels operating in southeast Alaskan waters. A visual inspection revealed evidence of water accumulation on the main deck and visible smoke coming from the engine compartment as indicators of mechanical trouble. The rescue operation proceeded according to established protocols. Using the rescue hoist on the helicopter, I was lowered to the deck of the vessel, where I was greeted by 4 crew members who appeared to be in good physical condition despite the mechanical issues with their vessel. Captain Robert Mloud, First Mate Thomas Anderson, deck hands William Foster and James McCarthy, and all of them cooperated fully with the rescue efforts, were the crew members. However, as I was performing the crew members' initial medical evaluation, I began to notice details that appeared to be out of sync with the circumstances they had described and the general duration of their distress call. Even though their attire was appropriate for maritime work, it appeared to be older than what would be expected of modern fishermen. Even more puzzling, the vessel's fittings and their personal gear displayed wear patterns that suggested decades of use rather than typical operational aging. When I questioned Captain Mloud about the vessel's history and their fishing operations, his responses included references to fishing regulations, market conditions, and geographical landmarks that did not align with current maritime industry standards. He used terminology that had been out of date for a number of decades to describe cannery operations in fishing areas and mentioned fish prices that were not consistent with current market values. The rescue operation continued without immediate issues despite these unusual details. We began the return flight to Air Station Sitka for standard post, rescue processing, and debriefing after successfully hoisting all 4 crew members onto our helicopter. The Pacific Dawn was left abandoned at sea pending recovery by commercial salvage operations, as is standard protocol for vessels that cannot be immediately repaired or safely towed. The rescued crew members provided additional details about their circumstances on the return flight, which further cast doubt on the veracity of their accounts. They claimed to have been fishing in areas that conservation concerns had kept closed to commercial activity for more than 2 decades. They described encounters with other vessels and personnel who had been confirmed deceased in maritime accidents that occurred decades earlier. Most troubling of all, we were unable to locate any records of the Pacific Dawn or any of its crew members in our current maritime registration systems when we attempted to verify their identities and vessel registration using standard Coast Guard databases. Captain Mloud provided the vessel identification numbers for a fishing boat that had been reported lost with all hands in 1987, 15 years before I joined the Coast Guard. The rescued crew members were dealt with in accordance with standard post rescue procedures upon landing at Air Station Sitka. These included a medical evaluation, the filing of administrative paperwork, and arrangements for temporary lodging until the status of their vessel could be resolved. However, within hours of their arrival at our facility, all 4 individuals had simply vanished from the base without explanation or trace. Their departure was not recorded on security cameras, and the individuals who had been assigned to assist them had no recollection of their presence following the initial processing procedures. It was as if they had never existed, despite the detailed documentation of their rescue operation and the physical evidence of our helicopter's fuel consumption and flight time records. 3 weeks later, we received an identical distress call from the same coordinates, using the same vessel identification and crew information. I was again assigned as the primary rescue swimmer for what appeared to be the same rescue operation. Despite the fact that the situation was impossible, the Pacific Dawn was found in the identical location and condition with the same crew members, providing the same identification and describing the same mechanical problems in the same terminology. Over the course of the past year, this pattern has occurred 4 more times, with intervals between incidents ranging from 2 weeks to several months. Each rescue operation proceeds identically to the previous ones with the same crew members, the same vessel condition, and the same unexplained disappearance of rescued personnel upon arrival at our facility. I have attempted to document these erroneous operations through official channels. However, administrative staff members appear to have no memory of similar incidents in the past and consistently file my reports. My crew members show no recollection of having conducted these same rescue operations multiple times, and they treat each occurrence as a routine, first-time emergency response. The most unsettling aspect of these repeated encounters is the gradual realization that I am apparently the only person who retains memory of the pattern across multiple incidents. During each rescue operation, I recognize the crew members and anticipate their responses to my questions, but they show no recognition of our previous encounters and provide identical information as if meeting me for the first time. I've started to think that these rescue operations are a supernatural or temporal anomaly that keeps the Pacific Dawn crew and our rescue workers stuck in the same emergency scenario over and over. The historical details provided by the rescued crew members suggest that they may be the actual fishermen who were lost in 1987, somehow kept in a state that lets them experience their final emergency multiple times without realizing that their situation is cyclical. Underneath their deceptively calm surface, the waters of Southeast Alaska hold numerous secrets. There are reported lost vessels that send out distress calls for decades, and there are rescue operations that repeatedly save the same lives without ever finding a permanent solution. As a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, it is my duty to continue responding to these calls, but I fear that each identical operation draws me deeper into whatever supernatural force maintains this impossible cycle. Some rescues save lives, while others may condemn the rescuer to join the endless repetition of maritime tragedies that refuse to accept their final resolution. My name is Ashley Williams, but everyone who knows me calls me Ace. For more than a decade, I have been flying bush planes through the Alaskan wilderness, and there is not a mountain range, valley, or remote airstrip in this state that I have not navigated at least a dozen times. Flying is not just my profession. It is my passion, my calling, and quite honestly, the only thing I have ever been truly exceptional at in my entire life. When you are piloting a small aircraft through some of the most unforgiving terrain and unpredictable weather conditions on Earth, you learn to trust your instincts. Never underestimate the power of the wilderness to surprise you. Rely on your experience. When I was 16 years old, I learned to fly from my uncle, who owned and operated a small charter company out of Anchorage. He showed me that pilots in Alaska do more than just provide transportation. We are lifelines for remote communities, responders to emergencies when they occur, and sometimes the only link between civilization and the vast emptiness that makes up this amazing state. I've flown everything from medical evacuations to supply runs for tourists looking for adventure and researchers doing important scientific work in air. Only locations over the years. My reputation for reliability and skill has earned me a steady clientele of repeat customers who trust me to get them safely to their destinations, regardless of weather conditions or the remoteness of their final locations. My perfect safety record and my capacity to land on improvised airstrips that would frighten the majority of pilots are things of pride for me. However, in September of last year, during what should have been a routine charter flight, That assurance in my abilities and knowledge of Alaskan airspace was shattered. The job came through my regular booking agent on a Tuesday morning. A family of 4 from Seattle wanted transportation to a remote fishing lodge located approximately 200 miles northeast of Fairbanks. David and Patricia Henderson, both in their mid-40s, as well as their teenage children Michael and Sarah, who appeared to be approximately 16 and 14 years old, were the clients. They appeared to be typical tourists, excited about their excursion into the wilderness and full of inquiries about the area's wildlife and geography. The weather forecast for the day was excellent, with clear skies and minimal wind conditions predicted for the entire route. My aircraft, a reliable Cessna 185 that I have owned and maintained personally for 8 years, was in perfect mechanical condition following a comprehensive inspection just 2 weeks prior. The flight plan was simple: a straight line over familiar terrain that I had flown numerous times before without incident. We departed Fairbanks International Airport at exactly 10:30 in the morning, with an estimated flight time of 1 hour and 45 minutes to reach the remote landing strip adjacent to the fishing lodge. The Henderson family was in high spirits, taking photographs through the cabin windows and marveling at the stunning wilderness scenery unfolding beneath us. Everything proceeded normally for the first hour flight as we crossed over the endless expanse of forests, lakes, and mountain ranges that define interior Alaska. But somewhere around the halfway point of our journey, I began to notice subtle discrepancies that initially seemed too minor to be concerning. Despite still being Alaskan wilderness, the landscape below appeared slightly different from what I had anticipated along this particular route. Lakes that ought to have been well-known landmarks appeared to have changed shape or were missing entirely, and mountain peaks appeared to be positioned at slightly different angles. I attributed these observations to atmospheric conditions, or perhaps fatigue affecting my perception, and continued following my compass, heading, and GPS coordinates toward our destination. However, as we progressed further along the route, the discrepancies became more pronounced and impossible to ignore. My maps showed rivers flowing in opposite directions, and the entire topographical layout of the land appeared to be shifting slowly beneath us. Everything seemed to be working normally when I checked my instruments. The compass was steady, the GPS was providing consistent readings, and the engine was running smoothly without any signs of mechanical problems. However, there was something fundamentally off about our surroundings that I could not rationally explain. When I turned around to check on my passengers' comfort and safety, I saw the first truly alarming sign that something supernatural was taking place. When we left Fairbanks, Henderson appeared to be a pretty woman in her mid-40s. Now she looked noticeably older. Her hair, which had previously been predominantly brown with only a few scattered gray streaks, was now significantly more silver, and she had developed fine lines around her eyes that clearly weren't there when we first boarded the plane. At first, I was under the impression that the cabin lighting was creating optical illusions, or that I had simply failed to carefully observe her appearance during our pre-flight preparations. However, when I looked at her husband and their children, I noticed similar, albeit subtle, aging characteristics. Mr. Henderson's hairline had slightly receded. Their son Michael appeared to have gained height and developed more mature facial features, and their daughter Sarah appeared to be approaching adulthood rather than 14 years old. When I realized that, based on my instruments and calculations, we should have arrived at our destination nearly 30 minutes earlier, my confusion and alarm grew. Yet, the landscape below showed no signs of the fishing lodge or the distinctive geographical markers that should have indicated our proximity to the landing area. Instead, it appeared as though we were stuck in some kind of geographical loop as we flew over the same wilderness landscape over and over. I made the decision to contact air traffic control to report our situation and request guidance. However, when I tried to use the radio, I found that every communication frequency was just filled with static. I was unable to communicate with any ground stations or other aircraft in the vicinity, regardless of which channel I selected or how I adjusted the equipment. As our flight continued beyond what should have been our arrival time, the aging process affecting my passengers accelerated dramatically. Mrs. Henderson's face began to show deep wrinkles as her hair turned completely white. Mr. Henderson began to move with the deliberateness of an elderly man after adopting a prominent stoop in his posture. Their children continued growing and maturing at an impossible rate, transforming from teenagers into adults before my eyes. The most horrifying aspect of this supernatural phenomenon was that my passengers seemed completely unaware of the changes occurring to their bodies. They continued chatting cheerfully about their vacation plans and pointing out interesting features in the landscape below, apparently oblivious to the fact that they were aging decades within the span of hours. I checked my own appearance in the small mirror mounted near the instrument panel and was relieved to discover that I appeared unchanged. Whatever force was affecting my passengers seemed to be sparing me from the same fate, though I had no understanding of why I might be immune to its influence. Despite the fact that my instruments showed that time was progressing normally in accordance with standard measurements as the hours passed, as if the aircraft's consumption rate had been altered along with everything else about our situation. The fuel gauge displayed levels that should have been impossible given the length of our flight. The scenery below continued to repeat itself incessantly, displaying the same mountains, forests, and lakes in a pattern that never changed, giving the impression that we were flying through the same area repeatedly. No matter what heading I selected or how drastically I altered our course, the terrain remained stubbornly identical. My calculations for the departure time indicated that my passengers had reached an age where they appeared to be in their 70s or 80s. By what should have been late afternoon, the couple Henderson moved slowly and spoke in the quavering voices of advanced age, while their children had become middle-aged adults with graying hair and mature features. They continued to act as if they were the same family that had boarded my plane hours earlier, blissfully unaware of their transformation. Their conversations became increasingly surreal as they discussed memories and experiences that seemed to span decades beyond what should have been possible given their original ages. The nightmare ended abruptly, just like it had begun. Without warning or explanation, the familiar landmarks of our intended destination suddenly appeared below us, exactly as they should have, according to my original flight plan. The landing strip that I had previously utilized with success was also clearly visible, as was the fishing lodge. As I began my descent toward the airfield, I glanced back at my passengers one final time and nearly lost control of the aircraft in shock. The Henderson family was back to how they were when we left Fairbanks that morning, looking exactly the same. There was no trace of the aging process they had undergone during our supernatural journey, and they showed no awareness that anything unusual had occurred. The landing proceeded without incident, and my passengers disembarked cheerfully, thanking me for what they described as a pleasant and uneventful flight. They showed no memory of the hours of impossible aging or the repetitive landscape that had trapped us in some form of temporal loop. Because I was aware that telling a story like this would probably end my career and tarnish my reputation as a trustworthy pilot, I have avoided discussing it in public. But I've quietly looked into similar accounts from other bush pilots and found that I'm not the only one who has experienced these impossible flights through places where time and space seem to be suspended. I keep flying the same routes across Alaska, but I'm always on the lookout for signs that the world is starting to come around to me again. The wilderness conceals mysteries beyond human comprehension, and some destinations exist in dimensions that we are not meant to visit. My name is Michael Chen Murphy, and I am a professional photographer who has dedicated the past 8 years of my life to capturing the ethereal beauty of the aurora borealis in the pristine wilderness of Alaska. My work is not limited to photography. Since getting my first camera in college, it has been the driving force behind every major decision I have made. It is my artistic obsession, my spiritual calling, and my driving force. I specialize in long exposure night photography, and I have built my entire career around documenting the magnificent light displays that dance across the northern skies during the darkest months of the Alaskan winter. After 3 years of traveling back and forth from my home in San Francisco, in search of the ideal aurora photograph that would establish my reputation in the competitive world of nature photography, I made the permanent move to Fairbanks in 2016. The northern lights had always fascinated me, ever since I first witnessed them during a college trip to Iceland. But the true artistic potential of aurora photography was only realized when I saw the incredible displays from Alaska's interior. I've always found the science behind the aurora phenomenon to be just as captivating as the sight of it. When gases in Earth's upper atmosphere and charged particles from the solar wind interact, they produce luminescent displays that can stretch hundreds of miles across the sky in patterns that change and evolve with mesmerizing complexity. There are never any two aurora displays that are the same, and the infinite variations in color, intensity, and movement make it possible to make images that are one of a kind and powerful in an endless amount of ways. My photographic equipment represents a substantial investment in specialized gear designed specifically for extreme cold weather conditions and extended night photography sessions, along with a collection of fast wide-angle lenses that are able to capture the entire spectrum of aurora displays. I use multiple camera bodies that are capable of exceptional performance in low light. My tripods and support systems are engineered to remain stable in high winds and sub-zero temperatures, and I carry backup power systems that can keep my equipment operational through the longest winter nights. I've developed relationships with local meteorologists, solar activity monitoring stations, and aurora forecasting services over the years, all of whom assist me in predicting the nights with the highest potential for spectacular displays. I have identified dozens of optimal shooting locations throughout the Fairbanks area, each chosen for minimal light pollution, unobstructed northern horizon views, and accessibility during winter conditions. National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, and a number of international photography competitions have acknowledged my dedication to aurora photography. Calendars, travel guides, and documentary films about Alaska's natural wonders feature my images. My work has made it possible for thousands of people, many of whom will never get to see the aurora in person, to experience a small portion of its overwhelming beauty and power. The night that changed everything began like countless others I had spent in pursuit of the perfect aurora photograph. The space weather forecasts were predicting exceptional geomagnetic activity with the possibility of aurora displays visible as far south as the Canadian border. Approximately 30 miles northeast of Fairbanks, in a rolling hilly region with excellent northern exposure and minimal terrain obstruction, I had positioned myself at one of my most productive shooting locations. That evening, the temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which was well within the range that I had mastered through years of cold weather photography. By 8:00 in the evening, I had set up my equipment and settled in for what I thought would be a long, but potentially rewarding night of shooting. Initial aurora activity was moderate, producing the typical green curtains and arcs that characterize most northern lights displays. However, the aurora activity started to get much more intense throughout the night than I had ever seen in my years of dedicated observation. The typical green luminescence was joined by brilliant reds, purples, and blues that painted the entire northern sky in colors so vivid they seemed almost artificial. Instead of the fluid organic shapes I had come to expect, the movement patterns became more complex and rapid, with individual light curtains weaving together in formations that resembled intricate geometric designs. The way the light patterns seemed to respond to my activities and presence struck me as particularly odd. The aurora displays would shift and intensify directly above my location when I changed my camera position or lenses, as if they were responding to my movements. The patterns would stop for a split second while I was taking pictures, as if they were posing for the camera, and then resume their intricate dance across the sky. Initially, I dismissed these observations as coincidental timing, or perhaps the result of fatigue affecting my perception after hours of intensive concentration. However, as the night progressed, it became impossible to ignore the aurora's apparent response to my presence. The light displays were not merely reacting to my activities. They were looking forward to them. Before I had even finished adjusting the settings on my camera, the aurora would begin to shift into more photogenic configurations as I prepared to photograph a particular formation. When I moved to a different shooting position, the lights would redistribute themselves across the sky to optimize the view for my new location. Most unsettling of all, when I paused to review images on my camera's display screen, the aurora would dim significantly, as if waiting patiently for me to return my attention to the sky. The first direct communication attempt occurred around 2700 in the morning, when the aurora formations began pulsing in regular rhythmic patterns that bore no resemblance to natural geomagnetic phenomena. Mathematical patterns were followed by the pulses. First came straightforward counting patterns, then prime numbers, and finally increasingly intricate mathematical relationships that were clearly the work of intelligent minds. The pulsing patterns began to match my heartbeat as I watched in fascination and growing alarm, as if an external force were gradually taking control of my cardiovascular system. I could feel my pulse rate adjusting to match the rhythm of the lights. The sensation was not painful or immediately threatening, but I was terrified to my core when I realized that something was altering my biological processes. Throughout the night, the aurora displays continued to change, acquiring characteristics that defied everything I knew about atmospheric physics and electromagnetic phenomena. Despite the constant movement of charged particles, which should have caused continuous shifting and flowing, individual light formations began to maintain stable shapes for extended periods, creating geometric patterns that remained in place. More disturbing still, some of these stable formations began to resemble recognizable symbols and characters from various writing systems. I observed what appeared to be mathematical equations, chemical formulas, and even fragments of text in languages I could not identify. The implication was clear. It's possible that the intelligence behind these displays had knowledge that went far beyond our current scientific capabilities and covered a wide range of human comprehension areas. Around 400 in the morning, the aurora activity reached an intensity level that should have been impossible under natural conditions. The entire sky from horizon to horizon was filled with brilliant multicolored light that cast shadows on the snow-covered landscape below. The temperature of the surrounding air began to rise noticeably, melting frost on my camera equipment and creating localized weather conditions that contradicted everything I knew about aurora-related atmospheric effects. At the peak of this supernatural display, I experienced what I can only describe as direct mental contact with the intelligence behind the lights. Complex information began to directly enter my consciousness without any audible or visual communication. I understood with absolute certainty that I was witnessing a form of communication from entities that existed far beyond the boundaries of Earth's atmosphere, regardless of their nature or origin. These beings had been observing human activities for some time and had developed the ability to manipulate electromagnetic phenomena in such a way that they could interact directly with the upper atmosphere of our planet. The aurora displays I was taking pictures of weren't real geomagnetic events at all. Rather, they were deliberate artistic expressions made just for me to see and record. Despite probably only lasting a few minutes, the mental contact went on for what seemed like hours. I learned a lot about the true nature of consciousness, space, and time during this period, which fundamentally altered my understanding of reality. I was shown visions of other worlds, other civilizations, and technologies that rendered human scientific achievement insignificant by comparison. I was profoundly altered by the experience when the contact finally ended and the aurora displays returned to more typical patterns. My photographs from that night captured images unlike anything in the scientific literature. Formations of the aurora with color combinations and geometric precision that would not normally occur in nature. Knowing that making such claims could damage my professional credibility and raise serious concerns about my mental health, I have never discussed the true nature of what happened that night in public. However, I continue my aurora photography work with the knowledge that I am not merely documenting natural phenomena, but potentially facilitating ongoing communication between humanity and intelligences that observe us from the vast darkness of space. The northern lights are no longer just beautiful displays of atmospheric physics. They seem to me to be art, messages, or perhaps warnings from beings whose motives and capabilities are largely a mystery to us. Every night I spend under the aurora-lit sky, I wonder if they are still watching, still communicating, and still deciding what role humanity might play in their incomprehensible cosmic plans. Some photographs capture more than light and shadow. Some images show encounters with forces that ought to remain hidden among the stars. Tommy Kowalski is my name, and I've been working in Alaska's oil fields for 18 years. I'm what you'd call a blue-collar guy who works dangerous, back-breaking jobs to keep America's energy flowing. I get my hands dirty. I have worked shifts that would break most men half my age, fought equipment failures in sub-zero temperatures, and drilled through permafrost. When it comes to completing the task at hand, I take great pride in being tough, dependable, and completely fearless. Growing up in a working-class family in Detroit, I learned early that you earn your place in this world through hard work and determination, not through complaints or excuses. My grandfather worked in automobile factories until they moved jobs overseas. Additionally, he taught me that a genuine man takes care of his family through honest labor. When I was 22 and struggling to make ends meet with a pregnant wife and mounting bills, I heard about the good money being made up in Alaska's oil fields. I packed everything I owned, said my goodbyes to my wife, and set out for Prudhoe Bay in the north to make money in one of the harshest industrial settings on Earth. The 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could reach 40 degrees below zero were brutal from the start, but the pay was better than anything I could have earned in Detroit. Handling equipment that, if you make one mistake, could crush you or burn you alive, and living in company barracks, surrounded by nothing but frozen tundra for hundreds of miles in every direction. However, I quickly adjusted, obeyed orders, and kept my mouth shut, gaining a reputation as someone who could be relied upon in times of danger or complexity. I started at the bottom of the crew hierarchy and worked my way up to become a senior drilling technician, where I was in charge of operating and maintaining some of the most expensive and sophisticated equipment used in the oil extraction process. I was proud of my role as someone the company management could trust with their most important operations. I oversaw younger workers and taught them safety procedures. The Prudhoe Bay oil field is like a tiny city that has been thrown into the middle of nowhere. Hundreds of workers live and work there in conditions that most people would find impossible. We had our own power plant, water treatment plant, dining halls, recreation centers, and even a small medical clinic run by doctors who were trained to treat injuries sustained in the workplace. The work never stopped. Operations continued 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, regardless of the weather or issues with the equipment. But despite all the safety training, all the protective equipment, and all the experience accumulated by decades of oil extraction operations, there are some dangers that no amount of preparation can adequately address. Some risks do not appear in any safety manual or emergency response plan because they are so far removed from typical industrial hazards. The incident that changed everything happened during a routine deep drilling operation in late March of last year. We were working on extending an existing well to reach newly discovered oil deposits approximately 3 valos in fact below the established extraction level. The company was eager to begin extracting potentially millions of barrels of high-quality crude oil because the geological surveys had revealed substantial reserves at that depth. I was in charge of the night shift crew, which consisted of 8 seasoned employees who had been with the company for an average of 12 years. For 6 days, we had been steadily drilling through layers of rock and permafrost that had not been disturbed in thousands of years. We were making excellent progress. There was no hint that we were about to encounter something that should have been buried forever, as the work was going exactly as planned. At approximately 20:30 in the morning, as we were preparing to advance the drill bit through another section of particularly dense rock formation, the entire drilling apparatus suddenly lurched violently. The initial hypothesis was that we had struck a pocket of pressurized gas that was causing unexpected resistance or some kind of geological instability. However, when we examined the monitoring equipment, none of the readings indicated the kind of subsurface conditions that typically cause such equipment malfunctions, and all of them appeared to be normal. We began to observe a thick, black substance seeping up through the drilling shaft and covering the drilling platform floor within minutes of the initial disturbance. At first, we thought that this was just crude oil reaching the surface earlier than expected, which would have been good news for production quotas and company profits. Several crew members actually cheered, thinking that we had made a particularly large deposit that would give everyone involved in the operation significant bonuses. But as the black substance continued flowing from the drill hole in increasing quantities, it became apparent that this material was unlike any crude oil any of us had ever encountered. The consistency was wrong. Too thick and viscous, almost like liquid tar, but with an oily sheen that seemed to shift and move independently of the substance itself. The smell was even worse. A foul odor that combined the worst aspects of decaying organic matter with something sharp and chemical that made our eyes water and burned our nostrils. When one of the younger crew members, a kid named Danny Martinez, who had only been working the fields for about 2 years, accidentally stepped in a puddle of the substance. Our first clue pointed us in the direction of something far more perilous than unconventional crude oil. As the black material appeared to eat through the thick rubber sole at an alarming rate, Danny immediately began screaming and clawing at his boot in an effort to remove it. Before the substance could reach Danny's foot, we were able to remove his boot. However, upon examination of the footwear, we discovered that the black liquid had completely dissolved the rubber and was beginning to penetrate the toe area's steel reinforcement. Whatever this material was, it had more corrosive properties than anything we had learned about hazardous materials. I immediately summoned the emergency response team and instructed the crew to leave the drilling platform. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated into something that defied all rational explanation before we could safely retreat from the area. The black substance began spreading across the platform at an impossible rate, flowing uphill against gravity and seeming to move with deliberate purpose rather than following normal fluid dynamics. More horrifying still, the substance appeared to be seeking out and targeting the crew members who remained in the area. The black liquid surged like living tentacles toward workers attempting to flee and appeared to be attempting to penetrate human clothing or skin. When a small amount of the material splashed onto the exposed hand of veteran driller Frank Kowalski, no relation to me. Despite the shared surname, the results were immediate and nightmarish. The normal flesh tone of Frank's hand gave way almost immediately to a sickly gray black that matched the substance. However, Frank's expression change was more disturbing than the discoloration. His face went completely blank. He stopped responding to our screams and attempts to assist him, and his eyes began to wander and become disoriented. Instead, he began walking deliberately toward the largest concentration of the black substance, moving with jerky, unnatural motions like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. By this time, the emergency alarms were blaring throughout the facility, and additional personnel were arriving to assess the situation and provide assistance. The black substance, on the other hand, appeared to act aggressively in response to the presence of additional humans, rising with renewed force from the drill hole and spreading even more rapidly across the platform and the areas surrounding it. Within 30 minutes of the initial outbreak, we had lost contact with 6 crew members who had been exposed to varying amounts of the mysterious substance. All of these men, whom I had worked with for years and knew to be trustworthy and mentally stable, had changed into something that hardly resembled who they used to be, following some kind of shared consciousness or external control that came from the black material itself. They moved perfectly in sync with one another. The infected workers showed no recognition of their colleagues or supervisors, did not respond to verbal commands or pleas for communication, and seemed driven by a single-minded purpose to spread the contamination to as many additional people as possible, in an effort to smear the black substance onto skin that was already exposed or force it into the mouths and noses of their intended victims. They would grab at anyone within reach. Facility management decided to use emergency quarantine procedures and seal off the entire drilling area as the crisis got worse, while hazardous material specialists utilized protective gear and chemical neutralizing agents to try to contain the outbreak. Those of us who had not been directly exposed to the substance were evacuated to a safe distance. However, the black substance was unable to be stopped or neutralized in any way. The material appeared to actively resist any attempts at containment, and chemical treatments had no effect whatsoever. Worse still, the infected workers appeared to be gaining strength and coordination as time passed, suggesting that whatever force controlled them was learning and adapting to our defensive measures. The nightmare reached its peak when the infected crew members began working together to sabotage the facility's safety systems and infrastructure. They systematically disabled fire suppression equipment, tampered with power distribution systems, and attempted to breach the containment barriers that were preventing the black substance from spreading to other areas of the complex, using their intimate knowledge of the oil field operations. Only by abandoning several coworkers who were calling for assistance as the infected workers surrounded them did I manage to escape the immediate area. The guilt of leaving those men behind still haunts my dreams, but I knew that staying would have meant becoming another victim rather than being able to warn others about the true nature of what we had unleashed. The incident was categorized as an industrial accident in the official company report as a result of equipment failure and exposure to naturally occurring toxic materials. The media was told that a drill bit malfunction had caused the release of hydrogen sulfide, gas resulting in several casualties, and the temporary shutdown of drilling operations in that sector. In addition to receiving standard death benefits and legal agreements prohibiting them from discussing any details of the incident, the infected workers were listed as fatalities. But I know the truth about what lies beneath Alaska's oil fields, frozen ground, deep below the surface, in locations that have been sealed off from sunlight and people for millions of years. In the shadows, ancient forces await the chance to reclaim a world they once ruled. Our industrial development and drilling operations are nothing more than pinpricks that occasionally break through the walls that keep these things contained. I know more people who work in oil fields. I moved back to the lower 48 states and found employment in construction work that keeps me safely above ground. But sometimes late at night, I still wake up thinking about those men whose bodies were taken over by that black substance. And I wonder if they are still there, waiting for the next group of workers to drill deep enough to free them, somewhere beneath the permafrost of Alaska. Some things should remain buried forever, and some energy sources are far too dangerous to pursue regardless of their potential value. Ranger Patricia Davis is my name, but everyone calls me Patty. For the past 15 years, I have worked as a park ranger at Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve in Alaska, and during that time, I have conducted over 300 search and rescue operations in some of the most challenging wilderness conditions imaginable. Even in the most stressful situations, I take pride in my professional approach to law enforcement and emergency response, which includes keeping detailed incident reports and adhering to established procedures. My track record speaks volumes. I have successfully located and extracted 96% of all missing persons cases assigned to me, often under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced wilderness professionals. Over 3 million acres of pure wilderness make up Glacier Bay, which contains some of North America's most breathtaking and dangerous terrain. We have active glaciers that have the ability to cave without warning, triggering tsunamis that have the potential to destroy an entire forest. We have mountain ranges where abrupt weather changes can ensnare hikers for days, and vast tracts of trackless wilderness where even seasoned outdoorsmen can become hopelessly lost within hours of departing established trails. Over 500,000 people visit the park every year, and many of them greatly underestimate the dangers of going into the real Alaskan wilderness. I have extensive training in mountain rescue, emergency medical response, wilderness survival, and law enforcement procedures. I am certified by the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the National Association for Search and Rescue. I have collaborated closely with Alaska State Troopers, rescue teams from the Coast Guard, and members of the armed forces on complex operations that necessitated coordination among numerous agencies and the use of specialized equipment. On August 14, I received an emergency call about 4 missing hikers who had failed to return from a planned 3-day backcountry expedition. This event fundamentally altered my understanding of what is possible within the boundaries of our national park system. The Portland, Oregon-based Brennan family has been identified as the missing individuals, together with their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie. Both in their early 40s, parents Michael and Jennifer were avid hikers. The Brennan family had planned to hike the difficult Ferryother Range Trail system and overnight camp at designated backcountry sites between 12 and 24 miles from the trailhead, according to their filed itinerary. Their planned return date was August 13th, and when they failed to check out with park headquarters by the required deadline, their emergency contact initiated the missing persons protocol. Weather conditions during their planned hiking period had been generally favorable, with clear skies and moderate temperatures. However, a severe storm system had moved through the area on their scheduled final day, bringing heavy rainfall and significant temperature drops that could have created dangerous conditions for anyone caught in the open without adequate shelter. I organized a comprehensive search operation that included 6 park rangers, 2 Alaska State Trooper investigators, a 4-person volunteer search and rescue team from Juneau, and a helicopter crew from the Coast Guard station at Sitka. We established a command post at the trailhead and began systematic searches along their planned route, focusing initially on areas where hikers most commonly encounter difficulties or become disoriented. There was no physical evidence of the family's presence along their intended route on the first day of searching. We found no footprints, no camping sign, no discarded equipment, and no indication that they had ever used any of the designated backcountry campsites listed in their itinerary. This was unusual, as even experienced hikers typically leave some trace of their passage that trained searchers can detect and follow. On the second day, our helicopter crew said they saw what looked like a camp about 8 miles off the established trail system in extremely difficult terrain that have required technical climbing skills to get to safely. According to our most recent geological surveys, the location was close to the base of an impassable glacial formation. Ground teams had to travel unmarked through thick forest and unstable scree fields for nearly 6 hours to reach the reported location. When we finally got to the coordinates that the helicopter crew had given us, we found a small campsite with equipment and personal items clearly belonging to the Brennan family that went missing. However, the observable evidence at the campsite immediately sparked unanswered questions. The tent was set up right and looked like it had been used recently. However, it was in a place that civilians shouldn't have been able to get to without special climbing gear and a lot of experience climbing rocks. More puzzling still, the campsite was situated on a narrow ledge approximately 40 feet below the main ridge line, accessible only by rappelling down a vertical rock face or climbing up from the glacier below. We heard voices calling for help from somewhere above our position as we looked at the abandoned campsite. Following the sound, we discovered all 4 members of the Brennan family on a small plateau, approximately 200 feet higher, up the mountain in an area that our geological surveys indicated should not exist according to the known topography of the region. Despite having been missing for more than 48 hours in difficult wilderness conditions, the family appeared to be in good physical condition, with no signs of exposure, dehydration, or serious injury. However, their behavior and responses to our questions immediately indicated that something was seriously wrong with their mental state or their perception of recent events. They provided contradictory, muddled, and illogical explanations when I asked them how they got to their current location. Michael Brennan insisted that they had only been hiking for a short time and had never established camp in the region. Jennifer Brennan claimed that they had been missing for several days, but she was unable to explain how they had managed to survive without the supplies and food we had discovered at the below-ground abandoned campsite. The most disturbing accounts came from the twin daughters, who, despite traveling together as a family, appeared to have no memory of one another. Sophie Brennan appeared truly perplexed by our references to her parents and insisted that she had been hiking alone. Emma Brennan responded to questions about her sister by asking who we were referring to. I observed additional anomalies that challenged my understanding of normal human behavior and physical capabilities during the technical rescue operation required to extract the family from their impossible location. Despite being positioned on a narrow ledge that should have terrified anyone with normal survival instincts, none of the family members showed any fear or concern about the dangerous drop-offs surrounding them. They moved casually near precipitous edges that should have triggered immediate panic responses in anyone with functioning self-preservation reflexes. During the hours-long rescue operation, The physical changes I observed in the family members were even more troubling. Michael and Jennifer Brennan appeared to be in their early 40s when we first found them, which is in line with the ages listed in their missing persons report. However, both of our parents appeared to be getting older right in front of our eyes as we worked to set up safe rappelling lines and safety gear. They had gray hair, wrinkled skin, and the slower movements that come with being older when we successfully extracted them from the mountain. They appeared to be in their 60s. The twin daughters presented an even more confusing situation. According to park records, Emma Brennan was 16 years old at the time, but she now appeared to be a young woman in her 20s. In contrast, Sophie Brennan seemed to have reversed her age, acting more like a child than a teenager, and appearing younger than her actual age. When we reached the base camp, and I attempted to verify their identities using the photographs from their hiking permits, the images no longer match the people we had rescued. The people in our custody appeared to be elderly parents with a variety of ages of adult children, in contrast to the typical middle-aged family with teenage daughters depicted in the photographs. In spite of their ordeal, the family was found to be in excellent physical health by medical personnel who examined them at the park first aid station. However, a psychological assessment revealed significant memory gaps as well as confusion regarding fundamental personal information concerning their occupations, relationships, or even their home address. None of the family members could provide consistent responses. Worst of all, we discovered that neither Michael nor Jennifer Brennan had ever resided at the Portland address listed in their paperwork when we contacted the emergency contact number included in their initial hiking registration. The phone number belonged to a family that had never heard of the missing hikers and had no knowledge of any planned trip to Alaska. The official incident report classified the case as a successful search and rescue operation with complications related to altitude sickness and temporary disorientation. Despite the absence of any verifiable connection to that location, the family eventually returned to what they believed to be their home in Oregon after being transported to Juneau for additional medical evaluation. However, I have continued investigating similar cases throughout my career, and I have discovered a disturbing pattern of missing persons who are found in impossible locations with altered appearances, missing memories, and identities that cannot be verified through normal channels. The wilderness holds secrets that extend far beyond dangerous weather and difficult terrain. Some searches uncover new information that challenges everything we think we know about reality. Some rescues bring back people who may not have gone into the wilderness in the first place, and some missing persons cases are better left officially closed regardless of the questions that remain unanswered. The mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes those secrets walk back out of the wilderness wearing familiar faces. My name is Edward Blackstone, though most people who know me well call me Eddie. I earned my doctorate from the University of Colorado in atmospheric physics. Additionally, I have been employed as a research meteorologist for the past 6 years with a focus on Arctic climate patterns and their connection to global weather systems. I've always been drawn to solitude and intellectual pursuits, preferring the company of books and scientific instruments to the social complexities that most people seem to find necessary for happiness and mental health. The opportunity to serve as winter caretaker for the remote Anakovok Research Station in the Brooks Range of northern Alaska represented the perfect convergence of my professional interests and my personal preference for extended periods of isolation. The position required someone with extensive meteorological training who could simultaneously collect data that would aid in our comprehension of the effects of climate change in the far north and maintain sophisticated weather monitoring equipment through the harsh Arctic winter. During the brief summer months, when landing conditions permit safe operations on the facility's gravel airstrip, small aircraft are the only means of access to the research station, which is approximately 200 meters north of the Arctic Circle. During winter, the station becomes completely isolated from the outside world, with the nearest human settlement over 300 MeV away, across terrain that becomes impassable once the severe weather begins in earnest. The building itself is made up of several buildings that are connected to each other and designed to withstand the extreme weather that this area experiences during the coldest months of the year. Advanced meteorological instruments, satellite communication equipment, and computer systems for data analysis and transmission are housed in the main research laboratory. Living quarters, a workshop for equipment maintenance, emergency supply storage, and backup power generation systems that guarantee operation even in the worst weather are all located in adjacent structures. When I accepted the position, I was fully aware that I would be spending approximately 5 months in complete isolation with no physical contact with other human beings from early November through late March. The psychological challenges associated with such extended solitude were extensively discussed during my pre-employment briefing, and I underwent thorough mental health evaluations to ensure my suitability for the assignment. However, the intellectual liberation that such isolation would provide was something I truly looked forward to. I intended to use the long winter months to finish several research papers that had been put off by university teaching and administrative responsibilities. In addition, I brought a large collection of scientific journals, philosophical texts, and classical literature to keep me occupied when the weather prevented active data collection. My assignment went exactly as planned for the first few weeks. My days were structured by the daily tasks of equipment maintenance, data collection, and analysis. In the evenings, I read, wrote, and peacefully contemplated the profound silence of the Arctic wilderness in the winter. The complete absence of artificial light pollution created opportunities for astronomical observation that would be impossible in more populated areas. I didn't find the isolation to be psychologically difficult. Rather, I found it to be deeply restorative. I had always been stressed by university life's constant noise and social demands, so the chance to live according to my own rhythms without interruptions felt like a return to my natural state. Although these brief communications were the only interruptions to my chosen isolation, I maintained regular radio contact with my supervisors to submit data reports and confirm my continued well-being. However, as the weeks progressed and the Arctic winter deepened, I began to notice subtle anomalies in the facility that gradually challenged my initial contentment with the assignment. Because they were so insignificant at first, I dismissed them as signs of wariness or the natural settling of buildings under extreme temperature changes. During the quietest parts of the night, when even the wind had stopped, and the only sounds that should have been heard were the mechanical hum of heating systems and scientific equipment, sounds that seemed to come from within the walls of the main laboratory, building provided the first clue that something was wrong. I started to hear what sounded like faint tapping or scratching noises coming from places where there shouldn't have been any moving parts. I attributed these sounds to the expansion and contraction of building materials under the severe temperature variations that characterize Arctic construction. However, as I listened more carefully over several nights, I began to detect patterns in the sounds that seemed too regular and purposeful to be explained by random structural movements. The scratching sounds were mostly heard in the early morning, usually around 300 a.m., and continuing occasionally until dawn. They seemed to move through the walls in deliberate paths, starting from one area of the building and progressing methodically to different locations, as if following predetermined routes through the internal structure. More disturbing still, The sounds began to seem responsive to my presence and activities. When I moved from one room to another, the wall sounds would follow, maintaining their position relative to my location. When I worked late into the night on research projects, the scratching would become more active, as if whatever was causing the disturbance was reacting to my extended periods of wakefulness. As a scientist, I was compelled to conduct systematic research on these phenomena rather than simply accepting supernatural explanations. I conducted thorough inspections of the building's interior walls, searching for signs of structural damage, insect infestations, or small mammal intrusions that might account for the mysterious sounds. However, these investigations revealed no obvious explanations for the disturbances. There were no visible cracks, holes, or other openings that could have let animals in, and the walls appeared to be in excellent structural condition. The building's construction specifications specified vapor barriers and solid insulation that ought to have prevented biological intrusion. Worst of all, the scratching sound seemed to come from places within the walls where the structure of the building should have made it physically impossible for such movements. As the winter darkness deepened and my isolation became more complete, the wall sounds evolved from simple scratching and tapping into more complex patterns that increasingly resembled attempts at communication. I began to hear what sounded like Morse code sequences, mathematical patterns, and even rhythmic arrangements that seemed to echo the meter of spoken language. I clearly heard what sounded like my own name being tapped out in Morse code from multiple locations within the walls simultaneously. On one particularly unsettling night, toward the end of January, the precision and coordination of these communications convinced me that I was dealing with an intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. Whatever was living within the structure of the building reacted immediately and dramatically to my attempts to respond to these apparent attempts at communication. The wall sounds would pause as if listening when I tapped back using simple patterns, then respond with increasingly complex sequences that clearly demonstrated problem-solving skills and pattern recognition. When I discovered a collection of personal journals hidden behind a loose panel in the workshop building, I realized the truth about my situation. The previous winter caretakers, who had worked at the research station for the previous 15 years, had written these journals to record experiences that were remarkably similar to my own. The journals revealed that every caretaker who had spent a winter alone at the facility had reported identical phenomena. The gradual realization that they were sharing their isolation with intelligences that shouldn't have existed, the regressive development of wall sounds, and apparent attempts at communication from within the structure of the building, most horrifying of all. The journals indicated that several previous caretakers had simply disappeared during their assignments with no trace found despite extensive search and rescue operations conducted the following spring. The final entries in these incomplete journals described increasing interactions with the wall dwellers and growing curiosity about their true nature and intentions. The final complete journal that Dr. 3 winters earlier, Margaret Henley gave the most in-depth account of what she had learned about the beings who lived in the research station. According to her observations, the wall dwellers were the preserved consciousness of previous caretakers who had become permanently integrated into the facility structure through some form of supernatural transformation. Doctor, in her final entries, Henley described her growing realization that the assignment's isolation and psychological pressure created conditions that enabled these trapped consciousnesses to gradually influence and eventually incorporate new caretakers into their collective existence. It appears that the process was gradual and subtle, beginning with straightforward attempts at communication and progressing through greater psychological integration until the line that separated the living caretaker from the wall dwellers was completely broken. As I read these accounts, I realized that my own experiences were following the exact same progression described by my predecessors. The wall sounds had become more frequent and complex. I was spending increasing amounts of time attempting to communicate with them, and I had begun to feel a growing sense of companionship with these invisible presences that contradicted my initial preference for complete solitude. Worst of all, I was experiencing periods where I could not remember how many hours had passed since I had started to lose track of time. I would come across evidence of completed tasks and equipment maintenance that I had no memory of doing during these gaps. I was motivated to take action when I realized that I was gradually losing my individual identity to the collective consciousness contained within the research station. I contacted my supervisors using the equipment for emergency communication and requested immediate extraction, claiming a medical emergency necessitated immediate evacuation. The isolated facility was reached by the rescue flight within 48 hours, which fought severe weather conditions. I could hear frantic scratching and tapping from all over the building as I prepared to leave, as if the wall dwellers were trying to stop me from leaving or send a final message. I have recommended that the Inactiveuk research station be permanently closed and the buildings demolished, but I have never been back there. However, I understand that budget constraints and scientific priorities have prevented implementation of my recommendations, and the station continues to operate with rotating caretaker assignments. Even in the quietest parts of the night, I sometimes still hear faint scratching sounds that seem to come from inside the walls of the building I'm in. I worry that my interaction with the beings at the research station may have established a connection that lasts beyond time and space, and that I might one day join the collective consciousness that grows in power with each new caretaker who accepts the cursed facility's isolation. Some forms of solitude aren't as empty as they seem, and some companions are best kept hidden in the shadows between walls.